Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to have a look at making some DIY coach connectors for 00 gauge coaches. I hope you'll agree these look pretty decent and make a big difference to how good the train looks in general. So without further ado, let's get going. I'll be working on the Hornby LNER Teaks that I've done in a previous video where I added the colouring, but the same method should really work for anything. So I've taken off one of the ends, get the door end, and I've also done a bit of a test piece which shows the bellows working to make sure this is going to work. And I've got some black card and some black foam as the materials for the project. The card is 160 GSM card from Hobbycraft. The thickness is quite important. You don't want anything too thick because that'll make it very difficult to fold and get the concertina correctly. You don't want anything too thin, obviously, because it needs to keep the structure. So one thing I did find doing this little test piece is that it's quite tricky to line them up if the lines aren't exactly square and the same distance apart. So I've done a little mock-up of what one of these is in terms of scale with measurements on it. So I know how big it needs to be and where I need to do the cuts and scores. So here's a drawing of that. Obviously it can be adjusted to the size of your design for your coaches based on the height and width of the corridor. The black lines indicate where I need to cut and the green lines indicate where I need to score to do a fold. In terms of cutting these out, I'm going to do a very particular method of doing both halves of one corridor connector next to each other, back to back, so that when I cut them and fold them they mesh perfectly. I found doing that really helped. So the first step is to cut a strip of the card all the way down the width of the final pieces. So that's going to be, in my case, 66 millimeters. So I measure and cut that carefully. Next I want to cut off a piece that is twice the total height. So that's twice times 32, which is of course 64 millimeters. So I cut a 64 millimeters piece off the end. And then I want to just do a score line down the middle of this piece at that 32 millimeter point, halfway bit on the 64 millimeter side, to indicate where I'm going to later cut it to get the two pieces. Next I want to do the score lines, so those shown in green, at perpendicular angle to the one I've just done down the middle. So those are going to go all the way across both pieces to make sure that they get in exactly the right place at the same distance. So I'll start with the two end ones, 1 millimeter from each end, followed by the three that are 16 millimeters apart, one in the center and to either side of it. You may be able to see on the piece of card I had in front of me at the time I had 14 millimeters written down. This is a mistake and it is in fact 16. And again, it is just worth making sure you get these exactly perpendicular to the original score line and edge cuts parallel to the edges that they should be parallel to, otherwise the finished product won't look as neat. And then it's a case of doing the cuts where the two halves are going to mesh into each other. So in my case 16 millimeters, half of that 32, either side of that score line that we did across the whole piece down the middle. So this is really quite important to make sure these cuts are square again and the correct length. So take your time, get them in the middle of those scores, the green lines, and make sure you get this right. So yeah, all 4 of those. And then finally we can cut along that full length score line to separate the two halves, and hopefully they'll be exact matches for each other. And then it's a case of folding each of these halves. So each fold is an alternate direction. What I recommend doing is the two outer 1 millimeter folds, using the score line going away from the score line over the edge of a steel ruler for that, just pushing with your nail or something similar along the edge of the steel ruler to get a nice neat fold on those. And then the one in the middle will be the same direction, and the two kind of in between the opposite direction around. And you can use the exact same process for both pieces. So the next part is the slightly fiddly part, where you try to interlace each half cut with the opposing one on the two pieces. Just take your time with this. Hopefully if you've done the cutting precisely and squarely, it won't be too tricky, but it is just worth taking your time and making sure you get them all lined up so you don't damage it. Just interlace those. Then once we've got the completed bellows, they're all very rectangular still, so we just need to shave off the corners at the top to match the curvature on the door. So try them against the door, and then with the scalpel just curve them off slightly. So it's a bit hard to see through my hair. Next we want to do the foam for fitting it into the doors on each coach end. So these want to be a bit of a friction fit, so that you want a bit of foam that's a bit shallower in thickness than the door hollow. So I'm using something that's about 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and then carefully measure and cut the strip of foam to the width of the door frame on the inside. But you want to make it a friction fit, so make sure it's not too small. I did do one of these on a second attempt that was too small, so I had to try again. And then of course you cut it down to height as well. I found that was easier done using scissors than the scalpel blade and straight edge, so I did the long cut with a straight edge and scalpel, and then scissors for the shorter cut. So with a bit of a test fit, that seems to work quite well. You've got to also, I found, trim off the corners at the top of the door frame, just because they're kind of angled in a little bit, so I just use the scalpel to do that. And you can then just repeat that process for a second piece for the opposite end of the corridor. Then you just need to attach the foam pieces to the combined pieces of card. I use double-sided tape for this, so it's a bit off camera, but that seemed to be just the right width and easy to attach. It's just worth making sure you get it in exactly the right place so that the corridor is in the right height relative to the door frame. And that's pretty well the finished product. So these should be a friction fit into the door ends, and then you can reattach your end piece of the carriage to the actual carriage, or at least in this case carriage body, as I've got them disassembled, and test them out. They seem to work quite well and look pretty good, and they're much cheaper than the ones you can buy, which are about £7. These just take a few minutes and a bit of card and foam. So I hope you found that useful. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you next time.